In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Ocre Juane. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. The nib and paper have a huge effect on how usable this ink is. Now, it does give a bunch of tone variation by pen and lots of shading. Its darker tones look fantastic. As a yellow, most people won't even watch this video, and they're going to be missing out on an outstanding ink. Though this is not an ink for huge amounts of daily writing, and I would say to avoid it on toned papers, the Kaweco and the Platinum 3776 Soft Fine really did highlight flaws that this ink has. Don't let that dissuade you from using this ink, especially since I see so many people in the community like using gusher of a pen, so this is not something you should really be concerned about. I think when you're using this ink, you just have to be cognizant of the fact that the paper you're on, a cream-colored paper, it's not going to look as good. A very white paper, it's going to stand out and look amazing. I said I'm not sure about it as a primary, just go with this ink, and that's true. I do think this is an amazing second ink for someone to be using on the page. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Kaweco Brass Sport with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, you see that it is a very, very light tone. That's the most noticeable thing about it. And I don't even think it's going to come through especially well on camera. Though I can read it, I think a full page like this could be a little hard on my eyes, a little bit of strain. Now, there's no feather, there's no spread, there absolutely is shading, and when it shades, it looks gorgeous. It gets to a nice orange tone in its darkest areas. The broad nib, now this is a little wetter than that soft fine. It is much darker than the soft fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has a ton of great shading. It looks absolutely amazing. I can see this being a whole page. It's dark enough to not be a kind of a problem. You still have that yellow to orange, kind of a sunset look to it. The music nib is where I think this ink is standing out the most, and you get a ton of the orange and the yellows from this ink. It is absolutely amazing to look at. No feather, no spread, lots of shading, absolutely beautiful to look at in its entirety. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no ghosting and no bleed through. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib. A Platinum 3776 with a broad nib. A Platinum 3776 with a music nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is still very light, though the more absorbent paper makes it easier to read than it was on the Clairfontaine. There's no feather, no spread, and there still is shading. Even on this more absorbent paper, this ink wants to shade. Looking at the broad nib, there is no feather, no spread. There's some decent shading. In general, it's a bit darker than we got with the soft fine, which I really do expect when using these pens that would happen. This looks really good here. I mean, I very much like it. Looking at the music nib, there's no feather, there's no spread, there's some very nice shading, especially when you look at just heredity on the right the right word on the top line. Absolutely beautiful in that ombre in and out of its shading. So very nice. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, you see that it is lighter than we had on the last paper, probably about the same tone that we were seeing with the Clairfontaine. Maybe a shade or two darker. I think it's a little more readable here. It has no feather. It has no spread. It only has a couple of moments of shading. The more absorbent paper is eating most of this shading, though there is a little bit of it. The broad nib is darker than the soft fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has shading coming through. This is a shade machine. It is truly looking great. It's not losing the fact that it's yellow in the shading, even though it does work its way towards the orange. So gorgeous. It should be called a sunset, and then nobody would want to try it. The music nib is darker than the broad. It has no feather. It has no spread. It is still offering some shading. It's much gentler in and out. You really, when you look at it as a whole, you start seeing lighter and darker areas. It's a very understated shading that's going on that looks very nice on the page. Looking at the back of the page, I see a couple spots on the music nib where it went deeper into the page. None of this came through. None of it touched the page underneath. There's the slightest bit of ghosting. You could use the back of this page. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we are getting no feather, no spread, a very nice shading, a very light tone. Again, just like we were getting with the Clairfontaine, very light, not something I would run to, but I do think this is usable. Do I see a reporter using this? No, but that doesn't stop me from wanting to try it. The broad nib is quite a bit darker than the soft fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has gorgeous shading the whole way through. I have become a huge fan of yellow inks, especially when they can look like this. Just absolutely amazing. The music nib is a bit darker than we got with the broad. There is a tiny bit of feathering that is occurring here. There's no spread. There's plenty of shading going on. Now, I did say that there's some feathering, which generally is a bad thing, but it's a much more inexpensively produced paper, and the feathers that happen are very tiny, and you really have to be looking to see them. I didn't see them just at a glance, and when I just glance at it, I don't see it. Only when I study the paper looking for feathering do I find it. Looking at the back of the page, we have very minor ghosting and we had no bleed through. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Callifolio Ocre Juane. Here is Diatramentis Emma Goldman Gold. Here is Diamine Amber. Here is Krishna Danu Udak. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get feathering. We get a tiny bit of spread. We get shading. The shading looks good. I don't think this looks nearly as good as it has on any of the papers so far. So far, this is its worst performance, but this paper is typically not doing as well as the others. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than the soft fine. There's feathering, there's spread. You can read it, considering that these are not the notebooks that you normally take class notes in. You just have to be able to archive them and hold on to them. It's there and it's readable. It's got that going for it. The music nib is about the same tone as the broad. It feathers, it spreads, it does shade, it otherwise looks gross here. I really don't like it, and I'm going to not bash it and just move on from there because it's only been this paper that's not been really good. When we look at the page underneath, we see that there are some spots that I circled with the broad and the music nib that it did touch the page underneath. This is a very cheaply produced and very thin paper. When we look at the back of the page, we see a massive amount of ghosting, which we really should expect with this. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is Lamy Green. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Deep Sea Green. Here is Platinum Brown. Here is Sailor Kobe number 7. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the soft fine nib, there is some feather, there is some spread, there is some shading. As I said, this is a machine that wants to shade, and it does shade, and it does it well. I think this looks fairly good here. The color's probably too light to generally use on this paper, but if you wanted to, I think you could. The medium nib is darker than we got with the soft fine. It has feather, it has spread, both of those are expected. You can read what's put there despite my deplorable handwriting and assault on cursive writing everywhere. It shades some, only a little bit. I think a little less than we saw in the soft fine. The music nib is about the same tone that we got with the broad. It feathers, it spreads, it looks almost as bad as it did on the last writing sample. I really don't like it, although it is very much being a yellow here and not leaning into that orange. I just really don't like it from the music nib on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, there was none of it that touched the page underneath. Although you see a lot of areas where it looks like it might have wanted to, it didn't. It changed its mind and was behaving. I think it did pretty well here. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Any pen that is wet or super wet is going to give you a great tone with great shading all the way through. It's going to look absolutely amazing. Personally, I would avoid using a dry pen like the Platinum 3776 with a soft fine, for example. I used it for the writing samples because I really thought it was going to bring out the worst in the ink, and it did, which I was setting it up for that failure, but just to be able to see it. I wouldn't normally go for a dry pen when looking at a yellow ink, so my doing that is not anything that is a problem with the ink. It's what I did. Use a wet pen, it's going to be gorgeous. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.